The blizzard hit with a fury that stripped the breath from Margaret Porter's lungs as she stumbled through knee-deep snow. Her fingers numb beneath sodden gloves and her hope dying with each punishing gust of wind that threatened to knock her from her feet. She had left Porterville, California, 2 days ago on the stagecoach heading north through the mountains toward Oregon. And now here she was in January of 1883, separated from her traveling companions when their coach had overturned in the storm, wandering lost through what felt like the end of the world. The pine trees around her bent and groaned under the weight of ice, their branches reaching down like skeletal fingers, and Margaret could no longer feel her toes in her leather boots. She was 22 years old, a school teacher who had been heading to a new position in Portland, and she was going to die out here in this frozen wilderness before she ever taught another child to read. Then, through the white curtain of snow, she saw it. A cabin, small and dark, nestled against a rocky outcropping that provided some shelter from the wind. Smoke rose from its chimney, barely visible against the gray sky. Margaret tried to call out, but her voice was stolen by the storm. She pushed forward, dragging one foot after the other, her skirts heavy with ice and snow, until she reached the rough wooden door and pounded on it with what little strength remained in her arms. The door opened so suddenly that Margaret nearly fell inside. Strong hands caught her, steadying her, and she found herself looking up into the face of a man who seemed as surprised to see her as she was relieved to see him. He was tall, perhaps 26 or 27, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and gray eyes that widened at the sight of her standing on his doorstep like some frozen apparition. His jaw was covered with several days' worth of stubble, and he wore a simple wool shirt and canvas pants held up by suspenders. "Help me," Margaret managed to whisper, and then her knees buckled. The man caught her before she hit the floor, his arms surprisingly gentle as he lifted her and carried her inside, kicking the door shut behind them. The warmth of the cabin felt like fire against Margaret's frozen skin, painful and wonderful at the same time. He set her down in a chair near the pot-bellied stove, then quickly moved to add more wood to the fire. "We need to get you out of these wet clothes," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "You'll catch your death otherwise." He moved to a trunk in the corner and pulled out some blankets and what looked like a large shirt. He handed them to Margaret, then turned his back to give her privacy. Margaret's fingers were so numb that she could barely work the buttons of her dress, but she managed to strip off her wet garments and wrap herself in the blankets, pulling the man's shirt on underneath for warmth. It smelled of wood smoke and soap. "I'm done," she said, her teeth chattering. He turned back around and nodded, gathering her wet clothes and hanging them on hooks near the stove to dry. Then he went to his small kitchen area and poured something from a pot into a tin cup. He brought it to her, and she accepted it gratefully, wrapping her hands around its warmth before taking a sip. It was coffee, strong and bitter, but it tasted like salvation. "Thank you," Margaret said. "I thought I was going to die out there." The man nodded but didn't say anything. He moved to the window and looked out at the storm, his shoulders tense. Margaret studied him in the firelight. He had a strong profile with a straight nose and a firm jaw. There was something lonely about him, something that went beyond merely being alone. "My name is Margaret Porter," she said. "The stagecoach overturned about 5 miles back. I got separated from the others in the storm. I've been walking for hours." The man turned to look at her, and she saw something flicker in his gray eyes. Concern, perhaps, or worry. "Augustus Grant," he said simply. "And you won't be going anywhere for a while. That storm isn't letting up any time soon." Augustus moved around the cabin with an economy of motion that spoke of long practice living alone. He retrieved more firewood from a covered pile just outside the door, checked the windows to make sure they were secure, and started preparing something that smelled wonderful on the stove. Margaret watched him, fascinated by the quiet competence he displayed. She had known many men in her life, but most of them filled any silence with words. Augustus seemed comfortable with the quiet, as if he had made peace with it long ago. "How long have you lived here?" Margaret asked, wanting to hear his voice again. Augustus was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, 3 years. Built this cabin myself. Do you ever go into town? Once a month for supplies. Porterville's a good day's ride from here. Don't you get lonely?" Augustus turned to look at her, and something in his expression made Margaret's heart ache. "You get used to it," he said, but Margaret could hear the lie in his words. Nobody got used to loneliness like this. It clung to him like a second skin, and she found herself wondering what had driven him to seek out such isolation. The wind howled outside, rattling the shutters, and Augustus ladled stew into 2 bowls. He handed one to Margaret along with a spoon, then sat down at his small table to eat his own portion. Margaret joined him, moving stiffly as feeling returned to her limbs in painful tingles. "This is delicious," she said after the first bite. The stew was simple but hearty, with venison, potatoes, carrots, and onions. "It's just stew," Augustus said, but she saw the corner of his mouth twitch slightly, as if he wanted to smile but had forgotten how. They ate in silence for a while, and Margaret found that it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. There was something peaceful about it, something restful. But she was a naturally curious person, and she wanted to know more about this man who had saved her life. "Were you a cowboy?" she asked, noting the worn saddle in the corner and the lasso hanging on the wall. Augustus nodded. "Worked cattle drives from Texas to Montana for 5 years. Before that, I grew up on a ranch outside Sacramento. What made you stop?" His jaw tightened, and Margaret immediately regretted the question. But after a long moment, Augustus answered, "Lost my family. My parents and younger sister to cholera. Couldn't stand to be around people after that. Their voices, their laughter. It felt wrong to be surrounded by life when everyone I loved was gone." Margaret's throat tightened with sympathy. "I'm so sorry." Augustus shrugged, but she could see the pain in his eyes. "It was 4 years ago. Like I said, you get used to it. But you don't really," Margaret said softly. "You just learn to carry it." Augustus looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time since she had arrived, she saw genuine interest in his expression. "You sound like you know something about loss." "My father died when I was 18, Margaret said, "thrown from a horse. And my mother passed 2 years later from pneumonia. I understand what it's like to feel alone in a crowded room." They sat together in the firelight, 2 people who understood grief, and something passed between them. A recognition, perhaps, or the beginning of understanding. The storm raged for 3 days. Margaret spent those days recovering from her ordeal, warming herself by the fire and watching Augustus go about his daily routines. She learned that he was a man of few words but many actions. He checked on her frequently, making sure she had enough to eat and drink, bringing her fresh water from the well he had dug near the cabin, and keeping the fire stoked so she stayed warm. He whittled figures from scraps of wood in the evenings, his large hands surprisingly deft as he carved horses and deer and birds with remarkable detail. On the second day, when Margaret felt strong enough to move around more freely, she began helping with the chores. Augustus protested at first, but she insisted. "I can't just sit here while you do everything," she said firmly. "Let me help." So she helped him prepare meals, learning that he actually had a well-stocked larder with dried beans, flour, salt pork, and preserves. She swept the wooden floor and tidied his belongings, not because the cabin was messy, but because she needed something to do with her hands. And she talked. Oh, how she talked. About her life in Porterville, about her students, about the books she loved to read and the places she dreamed of seeing. Augustus listened, and though he rarely responded with more than a nod or a few words, she could tell he was paying attention to every word. "You must think I'm terribly chatty," Margaret said on the third evening as they sat by the fire after dinner. Augustus looked up from the piece of wood he was carving. "No," he said. "I think your voice is the nicest sound this cabin has heard in 3 years." Margaret felt warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. "You could talk too, you know. I'd like to hear more about you." "Not much to tell," Augustus said, but then he seemed to reconsider. "What do you want to know?" "Everything," Margaret said, smiling. "Start with why you chose to build your cabin here in the middle of nowhere." Augustus set down his carving and leaned back in his chair. "I was driving cattle through here one spring, and we stopped to let the herd rest by the stream down the hill. I climbed up to this spot to keep watch, and I saw the sun rise over the mountains. It was the first time since my family died that I felt anything close to peace. When the drive was over, I came back here with tools and supplies and started building." "Do you still feel peaceful here?" Margaret asked. Augustus met her eyes. "I did," he said, "until you showed up and reminded me what it feels like to have another person around. Is that a bad thing?" "I don't know yet," Augustus said honestly. "I chose this life because people expected me to move on, to forget, to be fine. But I wasn't fine. Out here, I don't have to pretend." Margaret understood that better than he might have realized. "I became a teacher for the same reason," she said. "Children don't expect you to be anything other than yourself. They don't judge your grief or tell you it's time to move on. They just accept you." "Why were you leaving Porterville?" "The town school closed. Not enough children as families moved away to find better opportunities. I received an offer for a position in Portland. Good pay, a nice boarding house. It seemed like the practical thing to do." Margaret paused, "though I'm beginning to wonder if practical is always the right choice." Augustus tilted his head. "What do you mean?" "I mean that sometimes we make choices based on what makes sense rather than what makes us happy. I was so focused on the practical aspects of the move that I never stopped to ask myself if it was really what I wanted." "What do you want?" Augustus asked, and the question hung in the air between them. Margaret found she couldn't answer. Not because she didn't know, but because the answer was forming itself in her heart even as they spoke, and it terrified her. On the fourth day, the storm finally broke. Margaret woke to sunlight streaming through the cabin's small windows and Augustus already up, standing at the door and looking out at the transformed landscape. Everything was covered in white, pristine and beautiful and deadly. The snow had drifted up against the cabin walls and icicles hung from the eaves like crystal daggers. "It's beautiful," Margaret said, coming to stand beside him. "And dangerous," Augustus added. "The pass will be impassable for weeks, maybe longer." Margaret's heart did something complicated. Part of her recognized that being stranded was a problem. She had obligations, a job waiting for her in Portland. But another part of her, a part she was only beginning to acknowledge, felt relief. More time here meant more time with Augustus, more evenings by the fire, more moments of quiet understanding. "I suppose I'm stuck here then," she said, trying to sound disappointed and failing. Augustus glanced at her, and she could have sworn she saw relief in his eyes too. "I suppose you are." They fell into a routine over the following days. Augustus showed Margaret how to identify animal tracks in the snow, teaching her to distinguish between deer, elk, and rabbit. They set snares together, and Augustus showed her how to check his trap lines. Margaret proved to be a quick learner, unafraid of the cold or the work. She bundled up in spare clothes of Augustus's, her skirts layered over his extra pants, and followed him through the winter landscape. In the evenings, they talked more freely than before. Augustus told her about the cattle drives, about sleeping under the stars and the camaraderie of the other cowboys. He spoke of dust storms and river crossings, of stampedes in the night and the satisfaction of delivering a herd safely to its destination. Margaret told him about her students, about the joy of watching a child's face light up when they finally understood how to read, about the little girl who wrote her a poem and the boy who brought her wildflowers. "You miss teaching," Augustus observed one night. "I do," Margaret admitted. "But I'm also discovering that there are other things worth doing, other ways to live." Augustus was carving again, this time working on something larger than his usual pieces. "Like what?" "Like this," Margaret said, gesturing around the cabin, "living simply close to the land. Finding peace in quiet moments. I never would have discovered this if I hadn't been stranded here." "Some would call this existence lonely," Augustus said. "Some would be wrong," Margaret replied. "Loneliness isn't about being alone. It's about feeling isolated even when you're surrounded by people. I've felt more connected in these past few days than I have in years." Augustus's hand stilled on his carving. "Connected to what?" "To you," Margaret said simply, and the truth of it rang through the cabin. Augustus set down his knife and the piece of wood. He looked at Margaret, and she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. Want, hope, fear, all mixed together in an expression so raw it made her chest ache. "Margaret," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name. "I don't know how to do this." "Do what?" "This. Feel something for another person again. I spent 3 years building walls around my heart, and you walked through them like they were made of paper." Margaret moved closer to him, her heart pounding. "Maybe you don't need walls anymore. Maybe you just needed the right person to remind you that it's okay to feel." Augustus stood up slowly, and suddenly they were very close. Margaret could see the flecks of silver in his gray eyes, could smell the wood smoke and pine scent that clung to his skin. He raised one hand slowly, almost hesitantly, and touched her cheek with his calloused fingers. "I'm afraid," he said quietly. "Afraid of losing someone else, afraid of caring and having it ripped away." "I'm afraid too," Margaret whispered. "But I think maybe being afraid together is better than being alone." Augustus leaned down slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, but Margaret didn't move. When his lips touched hers, it was gentle and tentative, a question more than a statement. Margaret answered by reaching up and wrapping her arms around his neck, pulling him closer. The kiss deepened, becoming something more certain, more real. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing hard. "I haven't kissed anyone in 5 years," Augustus said, resting his forehead against hers. "I've only kissed 2 men in my entire life," Margaret confessed. "And neither of them made me feel like this." "Like what?" "Like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." That night, Augustus laid out his bedroll near the fire for Margaret while he took the loft above, maintaining propriety even as something fundamental had shifted between them. But they stayed up late into the night, talking across the distance, sharing stories and dreams and fears. Margaret learned that Augustus loved to read, that he had a small collection of books hidden in a trunk, everything from Shakespeare to agricultural journals. Augustus learned that Margaret could sing, that she had a voice like honey and sunshine, and when she sang old folk songs by the firelight, he felt something in his chest crack open and begin to heal. The next morning dawned clear and cold, and Augustus suggested they ride out to check on his horses, which he kept in a shelter down by the stream. Margaret agreed eagerly, excited to see more of his property. They saddled up his 2 horses, a sturdy bay gelding named Thunder and a smaller chestnut mare named Rosie, and rode through the snow-covered forest. The landscape was breathtaking in its winter beauty. Sunlight sparkled off the snow like diamonds, and the pine trees stood tall and silent, their branches heavy with white. Augustus pointed out various landmarks, a rocky outcropping where eagles nested in spring, a meadow where wildflowers bloomed in summer, a cave where he had once sheltered from a sudden storm. "How much land do you have?" Margaret asked. "About 160 acres, Augustus said. "I filed a homestead claim 3 years ago. As long as I improve the land and live on it for 5 years, it's mine." "That's incredible. Your own land, your own home." "It could use a woman's touch," Augustus said, then seemed to realize what he had implied and cleared his throat. "I mean, it's fairly basic. Just a bachelor's cabin." Margaret smiled. "I think it's perfect just as it is, but I wouldn't mind helping you plant a garden come spring, and maybe some curtains for the windows would be nice." Augustus looked at her, and Margaret saw hope dawning in his eyes. "Spring's a good 4 months away." "Then I suppose I'll be here a while," Margaret said, and the promise in those words hung between them like something tangible. They reached the shelter, and Margaret helped Augustus check on his small herd of 4 horses. They were all in good health, protected from the worst of the storm by the 3-sided structure Augustus had built. He had also constructed a clever system of water troughs fed by the stream, which hadn't frozen completely thanks to its swift current. "You've built all of this yourself?" Margaret asked, impressed. "Had to learn how. Back on the ranch we had hired men who did the building, but out here it's just me. I made plenty of mistakes at first, but you learn. I'm impressed. This must have taken months of work." Augustus shrugged, but she could see he was pleased by her praise. "Had nothing but time." They rode back to the cabin as the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold. Margaret felt content in a way she hadn't experienced in years. There was something about this life, about this place and this man that spoke to a part of her she hadn't known existed. That evening after dinner, Augustus retrieved something from his trunk and handed it to Margaret. It was a book, worn and well-read. "I thought you might like this," he said. "It's Wuthering Heights." Margaret took the book reverently. "I love this story." "I know it's not exactly cheerful," Augustus said, "but there's something about it that always spoke to me. The way Heathcliff and Catherine love each other, even though they can't seem to make it work." "It's a tragedy," Margaret said softly. "They waste their lives because they're too proud and too damaged to reach for happiness." Augustus sat down beside her. "I've been thinking about that, about wasted lives and missed chances. I came out here because I was running from pain, but maybe I was also running from the possibility of ever feeling anything good again." "And now?" Margaret asked. "Now I think maybe running was the wrong choice. Or maybe it was the right choice at the time, but it's not the right choice anymore." Margaret set the book aside and took Augustus's hand. His palm was rough and warm against hers. "What do you want, Augustus? Not what you think you should want, not what's practical or safe. What does your heart want?" Augustus looked down at their joined hands, then up at her face. "You," he said simply. "I want you to stay. Not because you're stranded, not because it's winter and you have nowhere else to go. I want you to stay because you choose to. Because you want this life and this place and me." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "I do want that. I know it's crazy. We've only known each other for just over a week, but I feel more alive here with you than I've felt in years. When I think about leaving, about going to Portland and teaching in some city school, my heart just sinks. But when I think about staying here, about building a life with you, everything feels right." "Are you sure?" Augustus asked. "This life isn't easy. Winters are hard and we're far from town. You'd be giving up a lot. I'd be gaining more, Margaret said. I'd have you and this beautiful place. And the chance to build something real. Augustus pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. I never thought I'd feel this way again, he said against her hair. After my family died, I thought the part of me that could love had died too, but you brought it back to life. They held each other as the fire crackled and the wind whispered outside. Margaret felt a profound sense of rightness, as if all the years of her life had been leading her to this moment, to this man, to this place. Over the following weeks, Margaret and Augustus grew closer still. They worked side by side during the day, checking trap lines and tending to the horses, chopping firewood and hauling water. Augustus taught Margaret to shoot his rifle, showing her how to aim and handle the weapon safely. She proved to be a natural shot, hitting the target he set up more often than not. Where did you learn to handle a gun? Augustus asked, impressed. My father taught me when I was young. He said every person should know how to protect themselves and provide for themselves. My mother disapproved, said it wasn't ladylike, but father insisted. Your father was a wise man. In the evenings, they read together, taking turns reading aloud from Augustus's small library. They discussed the books afterward, debating character motivations and themes late into the night. Margaret discovered that Augustus had a keen mind and thoughtful insights, and he seemed to bloom under her attention, becoming more talkative and expressive as the days passed. They also grew comfortable with physical affection. Augustus would rest his hand on the small of Margaret's back as she cooked. Margaret would lean against him as they sat by the fire. They kissed frequently, sweet kisses that promised more but never pushed too far. Augustus was always respectful, always mindful of propriety, but Margaret could sense the desire building between them, a tension that grew sweeter with each passing day. One morning in late February, Margaret woke to find Augustus already up and dressed in his best clothes, which he had clearly taken the time to wash and press. He had shaved his beard clean, leaving his face smooth and younger looking. He looked nervous, his hands fidgeting with his hat. What's going on? Margaret asked, sitting up and wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. Augustus cleared his throat. The weather's been clear for a few days. I was thinking we could ride into Porterville today. I know you must be worried about people wondering what happened to you. And there are some things I need to take care of in town. Margaret's heart sank. She had been so caught up in their private world that she had almost forgotten about the outside. Of course, she said, trying to keep the disappointment from her voice. I should send word to the school in Portland. Let them know I won't be taking the position. Augustus's eyes snapped to hers. You're sure about that? I've never been more sure of anything in my life. The ride to Porterville took most of the day as the snow made travel slow. They stopped frequently to rest the horses and to share a meal from the pack Augustus had prepared. As they drew closer to town, Margaret felt Augustus growing tense beside her. What's wrong? She asked. I haven't been around many people in a long time, Augustus admitted. It's going to be strange. Margaret reached over and squeezed his hand. I'll be right there with you. Porterville was a small town nestled in the foothills, with a main street lined with wooden buildings, a general store, a saloon, a small church, and a handful of other establishments. People stopped and stared as Augustus and Margaret rode through town. Margaret recognized a few faces, people she had known during her time teaching there. They stopped first at the telegraph office, where Margaret sent a message to Portland declining the teaching position. Then they went to the general store, where Augustus needed to purchase supplies. The proprietor, a heavy-set man named Mr. Jenkins, raised his eyebrows when he saw them together. Augustus Grant, as I live and breathe, Mr. Jenkins said. Haven't seen you in months, and Miss Porter. We all thought you had perished in that stagecoach accident. The other passengers made it back to town and said you'd wandered off in the storm. I found shelter at Mr. Grant's cabin, Margaret said simply. Mr. Jenkins looked between them, clearly noting Margaret's borrowed clothes and their easy familiarity with each other. I see, he said, and Margaret could practically see the gossip wheels turning in his mind. Augustus stepped forward, his jaw set. We'll need these supplies, he said, handing over a list, and I'd like to speak to Reverend Thomas if he's available. The Reverend's at the church, Mr. Jenkins said, but I can send someone to fetch him if it's urgent. It's urgent, Augustus said firmly. While they waited, Augustus and Margaret walked through town. People whispered and pointed, but Augustus ignored them, keeping his attention focused on Margaret. They stopped at the church, a small white building with a modest steeple, and found Reverend Thomas inside, preparing for the evening service. Reverend Thomas was a kind-faced man in his 50s with gray hair and wire-rimmed spectacles. He smiled when he saw Margaret. Miss Porter. Thank the Lord you're safe. We feared the worst when the stagecoach returned without you. I was fortunate, Margaret said. Mr. Grant saved my life. Reverend Thomas turned to Augustus, extending his hand. Then I owe you a debt of gratitude, young man. Miss Porter was a beloved teacher here. Augustus shook the Reverend's hand. Actually, sir, that's why we're here. I'd like to ask for your blessing and to request that you perform a marriage ceremony. Reverend Thomas's eyebrows rose. Marriage? Well, this is unexpected. How long have you two known each other? Not long, Augustus admitted, but long enough to know what we want. Reverend Thomas looked at Margaret. Miss Porter, is this truly what you desire? Marriage is a sacred commitment not to be entered into lightly. Margaret met the Reverend's eyes steadily. It is what I desire, Reverend. I know it seems sudden, but sometimes you simply know when something is right. Augustus is a good man and I love him. I want to build a life with him. The Reverend studied them both for a long moment, then smiled. I've been a minister for 30 years and I've learned to trust my instincts about people. I can see the love between you two. It's rare and precious. If you're both certain, I would be honored to perform the ceremony. We're certain, Augustus said, looking at Margaret. When would you like to be married? Today, Augustus said. Right now, if possible. I don't want to wait any longer. Reverend Thomas chuckled. Very well, but you'll need witnesses. Let me gather a few members of the congregation. Within an hour, they were standing before the altar of the small church. Mrs. Harriet Stevens, the minister's wife, and Mr. Robert Chen, who ran the town's boarding house, served as witnesses. Margaret wore her freshly cleaned dress, the one she had been wearing when she arrived at Augustus's cabin, and Augustus stood beside her in his pressed shirt and clean pants, holding her hands and looking at her like she was the most precious thing in the world. Reverend Thomas conducted the ceremony with warmth and sincerity, speaking about love and commitment, about partnership and faith. When it came time for the vows, Augustus's voice was strong and steady. I, Augustus James Grant, take you, Margaret Rose Porter, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to love you, honor you, cherish you, and protect you for all the days of my life. Margaret's voice trembled with emotion as she repeated her own vows. I, Margaret Rose Porter, take you, Augustus James Grant, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to love you, honor you, cherish you, and stand by your side for all the days of my life. Reverend Thomas pronounced them husband and wife, and Augustus kissed Margaret sweetly, sealing their union before God and witnesses. When they pulled apart, both of them had tears in their eyes. Mrs. Stevens hugged Margaret warmly. Welcome to married life, dear. I hope you'll be very happy together. Thank you, Margaret said. I know we will be. They completed the necessary paperwork, signing the marriage certificate and having it witnessed, then spent the night at Mr. Chen's boarding house. Augustus paid for the best room available, a modest but clean space with a real bed and lace curtains on the windows. That night, they consummated their marriage, coming together with tenderness and passion, learning each other's bodies and hearts. Augustus was gentle and attentive, making sure Margaret felt cherished and desired. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, and Margaret thought she had never been happier in her entire life. "Mrs. Grant," Augustus murmured against her hair, "I like the sound of that." "So do I," Margaret said, kissing his chest. "So do I." The next morning they purchased their supplies and headed back to the cabin, now properly married and committed to their new life together. The ride back seemed shorter, perhaps because they were both eager to return to their home. Yes, Margaret thought, it was home now. Not just Augustus's cabin, but their home together. Spring came slowly to the mountains, but when it arrived, it brought with it an explosion of life and color. The snow melted, revealing green grass and wildflowers. The stream swelled with runoff, and the forest filled with birdsong. Margaret and Augustus worked tirelessly, preparing a large garden plot near the cabin. They planted potatoes, carrots, beans, squash, and corn, as well as a variety of herbs. Margaret also planted flowers near the house, bright splashes of color that made Augustus smile every time he saw them. "I never would have thought to plant flowers," he said one evening as they sat on the porch he had built for her, watching the sunset. "That's because you're practical," Margaret teased. "But sometimes beauty for beauty's sake is important too." "I'm looking at beauty for beauty's sake right now," Augustus said, and Margaret blushed at the compliment. They fell into the rhythms of married life, working together seamlessly. Augustus taught Margaret to fish in the stream, and she proved surprisingly good at it, squealing with delight when she caught her first trout. Margaret taught Augustus some of the songs she used to sing with her students, and in the evenings, their voices would blend together in harmony, filling the cabin with music. In May, Margaret realized she was pregnant. She told Augustus one evening after dinner, nervous about his reaction. Augustus's face went through a series of emotions, shock, fear, and then pure joy. He pulled her into his arms and held her tightly. "A baby," he whispered. "We're going to have a baby. Are you happy?" Margaret asked. "Happy doesn't even begin to describe it," Augustus said. "Terrified, overwhelmed, and happier than I ever thought possible." Augustus became even more protective and attentive after that, insisting that Margaret not overwork herself, bringing her wildflowers just because, and talking to her growing belly when he thought she was asleep. Margaret found his devotion both touching and amusing. Summer brought long, warm days perfect for working the land. Their garden flourished, providing more vegetables than they could eat, so they preserved what they could for winter and traded the rest in Porterville for other supplies. Margaret made friends with some of the townspeople, particularly Mrs. Stevens, and a young woman named Rebecca, who ran the general store with her husband. Augustus started taking on occasional work for nearby ranchers, using his skills as a cowboy to help with roundups and cattle drives. The extra money allowed them to make improvements to the cabin, adding a proper bedroom and expanding the main living area. Augustus also built furniture, crafting a beautiful cradle for the baby that would arrive in January. As autumn painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Margaret's belly grew round and full. She moved more slowly now, but she was healthy and happy. Augustus read to her in the evenings from a book on childbirth and infant care that they had purchased in town, both of them trying to prepare for the enormous change coming to their lives. "What if I'm not a good father?" Augustus asked one night, his hand resting on Margaret's belly as the baby kicked against his palm. "You'll be an excellent father," Margaret assured him. "You're kind and patient and loving. Our child will be lucky to have you. I just keep thinking about my family, about how much my father meant to me, and how devastated I was to lose him. What if something happens to me? What if I leave you and the baby alone?" Margaret took his face in her hands, making him look at her. "Augustus Grant, you listen to me. We can't live our lives in fear of what might happen. Yes, terrible things happen sometimes. People we love die, but that doesn't mean we should close ourselves off from love and joy. It means we should cherish every moment we have together." Augustus kissed her softly. "When did you become so wise?" "I've always been wise," Margaret said with a smile. "You just weren't paying attention." Winter returned, but this time Margaret was prepared. She and Augustus had stockpiled enough food and supplies to last them through even the harshest blizzard. The cabin was warm and cozy, with thick curtains on the windows and a good supply of firewood. And most importantly, they had each other. In January of 1884, exactly 1 year after Margaret had stumbled through the blizzard to Augustus's door, their son was born. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Augustus feared he might lose Margaret. But she was strong, and with the help of Mrs. Stevens, who had agreed to stay with them for the baby's arrival, Margaret brought their son into the world just as dawn broke over the mountains. Augustus held his son for the first time with tears streaming down his face. The baby was perfect, with a shock of dark hair and his mother's delicate features. He was crying lustily, his small fists waving in the air. "He's beautiful," Augustus said, his voice choked with emotion. "He's absolutely beautiful. What should we name him?" Margaret asked, exhausted but radiant. Augustus thought for a moment. "Aaron," he said. "Aaron Thomas Grant, after your father and Reverend Thomas." "Aaron," Margaret repeated, testing the name. "It's perfect, Mrs. Stevens helped them through the first difficult weeks, teaching them how to care for their newborn son. Then she returned to town, leaving the small family to find their own way. Augustus proved to be a devoted father, getting up with Margaret during the night to help with feedings, changing diapers without complaint, and spending hours just holding his son and marveling at him. "I never knew I could love something this much," Augustus said one night as Aaron slept in his arms. "I thought I had reached the limit of what my heart could hold when I fell in love with you, but this little one has expanded it even further." Margaret watched them together, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. This was what happiness looked like. Not grand gestures or dramatic moments, but quiet nights by the fire with her husband and child, the three of them safe and warm and loved. The years that followed were good ones. Aaron grew into a bright, curious boy who loved exploring the forest with his father and learning to read with his mother. When he was 3, Margaret gave birth to a daughter they named Alice Marie. 2 years after that came another son, Andrew David. The cabin had to be expanded twice to accommodate their growing family, and Augustus built additions with pride, creating a real home for his wife and children. Margaret sometimes taught reading to children from neighboring homesteads, who would come to their cabin for lessons. She loved having students again, and Augustus built her a small schoolroom attached to the cabin where she could conduct her classes. The extra income was welcome, but more than that, teaching fulfilled something essential in Margaret's soul. Augustus continued to work cattle drives in the summer, but he never stayed away longer than necessary, always eager to return to his family. He taught his sons to ride and rope, to track and hunt, to respect the land and the animals that lived on it. He taught Alice the same things, much to Margaret's amusement and pride. Alice proved to be fearless, keeping up with her brothers in everything they did. On a warm summer evening in 1892, Augustus and Margaret sat on their porch, watching their children play in the meadow. Aaron was 14 now, tall and serious like his father. Alice was 11, with her mother's determination and her father's gray eyes. Andrew was 9, the most talkative of the three, always full of questions and observations. "Can you believe it's been 9 years since we got married?" Margaret asked, leaning against Augustus's shoulder. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday," Augustus said. "Other times it feels like I've loved you my entire life. Do you ever regret it, giving up your solitary life?" Augustus turned to look at her, his expression serious. "Margaret, marrying you was the best decision I ever made. You brought me back to life. Before you, I was just existing, going through the motions. You gave me purpose and joy and love. You gave me a family. I could never regret that." Margaret kissed him softly. "I love you, Augustus Grant. More every day." "I love you too, Margaret, more than words could ever express." That night, after the children were in bed, Augustus and Margaret lay together in their room, the window open to let in the cool night breeze. They could hear the stream in the distance and the soft calls of owls in the forest. "You remember the night we met?" Augustus asked. "When you pounded on my door, half frozen and desperate." "I remember thinking you were the most serious man I'd ever seen," Margaret said with a laugh. "You hardly said 2 words to me that first day. I didn't know what to say. I'd gotten so used to silence that I'd almost forgotten how to talk to another person. And then you showed up and filled my cabin with words and laughter and life." "You needed someone to talk to," Margaret said. "I needed you," Augustus corrected. "I just didn't know it until you were there." They held each other in the darkness, comfortable in the silence that no longer signified loneliness but rather deep companionship. Outside, an owl called to its mate, and somewhere in the night, its call was answered. The children grew and thrived. Aaron showed an interest in ranching and began working with his father and the neighboring ranchers during the summers. Alice discovered a love of drawing and filled countless pages with sketches of the mountains and forests around their home. Andrew wanted to be a teacher like his mother, and spent hours helping her with the younger students who came for lessons. In 1895, Margaret gave birth to twins, much to everyone's surprise. Another boy and another girl whom they named Adrian Paul and Amelia Rose. Augustus joked that their cabin was getting crowded, but he built another addition with a smile on his face, creating more bedrooms to accommodate their expanding family. When the twins were 2 years old, Augustus's homestead claim was finally complete. He now legally owned the land he had worked and improved for over a decade. He and Margaret celebrated by taking the whole family into Porterville for a special dinner at the town's new restaurant. It was a rare treat, and the children were on their best behavior, excited by the novelty of eating food they hadn't grown or hunted themselves. Reverend Thomas, now quite elderly but still sharp as ever, stopped by their table to congratulate them. "I remember the day you two came to me asking to be married," he said with a warm smile. "I knew then that yours would be a love story for the ages. Looking at your beautiful family, I see I was right." "Thank you, Reverend," Augustus said, shaking the old man's hand. "Thank you for believing in us when we barely knew each other." "Sometimes the heart knows what the mind hasn't figured out yet," Reverend Thomas said wisely. "You two were meant to be together. Anyone with eyes could see it." That night, back at their cabin with the children tucked into bed, Augustus pulled Margaret into his arms and danced with her in the main room, humming a tune he had heard at the restaurant. Margaret laughed and followed his lead, their feet moving across the wooden floor Augustus had laid with his own hands years ago. "What's this for?" Margaret asked. "Do I need a reason to dance with my beautiful wife?" No, but there's something on your mind, I can tell. Augustus smiled. You know me too well. I was just thinking about how much my life has changed since that winter day when you showed up at my door. I was so lonely, Margaret, so lost. I had convinced myself that isolation was what I wanted, what I deserved. And then you arrived, and everything changed. The blizzard brought us together, Margaret said. Best storm of my life, Augustus agreed. It gave me you and you gave me everything else. Our children, our home, our life together. You made me whole again. Margaret rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. We made each other whole, she said. That's what love does. It heals the broken places and makes us better than we were alone. They swayed together in the firelight, and if their feet didn't always move in perfect rhythm, it didn't matter. They had found their rhythm in life, and that was what counted. The years continued to roll by, bringing both joys and challenges. There were hard winters when supplies ran low, and summers when drought threatened their garden. There were illnesses and injuries, moments of fear and worry. But through it all, Augustus and Margaret faced everything together, their love growing deeper and stronger with each passing season. Aaron married at 21, bringing home a sweet-natured young woman named Sarah who fit seamlessly into the family. They built a cabin on the far edge of Augustus and Margaret's land, starting their own homestead. Alice, to everyone's surprise, announced at 18 that she wanted to go to San Francisco to study art. Augustus was reluctant at first, worried about his daughter in the big city, but Margaret encouraged him to let her go. She has your determination and my practical nature, Margaret said. She'll be fine, and she'll come home when she's ready. Alice did come home, 3 years later, with a portfolio full of beautiful paintings and stories of her adventures in the city. She opened a small art studio in Porterville, teaching drawing and painting to anyone interested, and married a banker's son who appreciated her independent spirit. Andrew became a teacher as he had always dreamed, taking over Margaret's school when she decided to retire at 50. He had inherited his mother's gift for connecting with children, and the little school thrived under his care. The twins, Adrian and Amelia, were inseparable growing up and remained close as adults. Adrian became a horse trainer, with a gift for working with even the most difficult animals. Amelia surprised everyone by becoming interested in medicine, and she traveled to Sacramento to study nursing. When she returned, she set up a small clinic in Porterville, providing much-needed medical care to the community. As Augustus and Margaret grew older, they watched with pride as their children built their own lives and started their own families. The cabin that had once been so quiet was now filled regularly with the sounds of grandchildren playing, of family gatherings around the large table Augustus had built to accommodate everyone, of laughter and stories and love. On a crisp autumn day in 1910, Augustus and Margaret celebrated their 27th wedding anniversary. They were both in their 60s now, their hair gray and their faces lined with the marks of a life well lived. Their children had organized a surprise party, bringing the whole family together at the original cabin, which still stood strong after all these years. As the sun set, painting the mountains in shades of gold and purple, Augustus took Margaret's hand and led her away from the celebration, walking to the spot where they could see for miles in every direction. It was the same view that had brought him peace all those years ago when he first decided to build his cabin here. "What are you thinking about?" Margaret asked. Augustus was quiet for a moment, then said, "I'm thinking about how grateful I am. Grateful for that blizzard that brought you to my door. Grateful for every day we've had together. Grateful for our children and grandchildren. Grateful for this life we've built." "No regrets?" Margaret asked. "Not a single one. Well, maybe one small regret. What's that? That we don't have more time, Augustus said. I could live 100 years with you and it still wouldn't be enough. Margaret squeezed his hand. Then we'll just have to make the most of the time we have. They stood together, watching the sun sink below the mountains, surrounded by the sounds of their family's celebration behind them. Augustus thought about the man he had been before Margaret, hollow and lost and alone. He thought about the moment she had pounded on his door, bringing with her not just a request for shelter but the possibility of a future he had never imagined. I was wrong, you know, Augustus said suddenly. About what? That first day I told you I had gotten used to loneliness, but I hadn't. I was just surviving, not living. You taught me the difference. Margaret turned to face him, her eyes still as bright and warm as they had been that first winter. And you taught me that sometimes the life we plan isn't nearly as good as the life that finds us when we're not looking. Augustus kissed her, soft and sweet, a kiss that held 27 years of love and partnership and commitment. When they pulled apart, both of them were smiling. From the cabin, they could hear their grandson calling for them, probably wanting them to come sing the old songs around the fire as they always did at family gatherings. Augustus and Margaret walked hand in hand back toward the light and warmth and love, grateful for every moment, grateful for each other, grateful for a blizzard that had changed both their lives forever. The quiet cowboy had finally found someone to talk to, and in talking, in opening his heart, he had found everything he never knew he needed. And the schoolteacher who had been heading toward a practical, predictable life had found adventure and passion, and a love that would last until the end of her days. Together, they had built more than just a cabin in the wilderness. They had built a home, a family, and a legacy that would continue for generations. And it had all started with a storm, a desperate knock on a door, and two lonely hearts finding each other in the most unexpected way. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky above the mountains, Augustus and Margaret rejoined their family, knowing that they had lived the kind of love story that people would tell for years to come. Not because it was perfect, but because it was real. Not because it was easy, but because it was worth every challenge they had faced together. The blizzard had stranded Margaret at Augustus's remote cabin, and in doing so, it had given them both the greatest gift of all, each other, and a love that would warm them through every winter to come.